I recently came across a interesting problem which was given to me as part of a job interview process. And since it looks like such a fun project, I thought I would record the development that I did for this and see how it works out. The basic problem is that we have a prototype, a robot cleaner, okay, that will run automatically at night. And our job here is to build a prototype, and do it as simply as possible. The robot will be given some instructions, input, and then it will just take those instructions and it will run by itself. We can see that in the morning we will ask the robot to report how many unique places it has cleaned. Okay. We can see otherwise that we've got standard in, so the commands are given by standard in, and the output, which is the number of unique places, an integer I guess, is by standard out. And the inputs have a format. The first line consists of the number of commands, okay, and that can be 0. You can have 0 commands, or you can have a maximum of 10,000 commands. The next line is the starting coordinates of the robot. It says here the value of each coordinate will be in the range minus 100,000 to plus 100,000. The same for y. Okay, so it's 200,000 wide and 200,000 high. And the third line consists of 2 pieces of data. First will be a single uppercase character, a letter, which is north, south, east, or west, and the second will be an integer containing the number of steps. Okay, and the steps can be 0 steps, or 100,000 steps. Okay, the robot should take in said direction, so you give it like 10,000 north, or north 10,000, it'll go 10,000 steps north. And obviously assume it cleans in all the locations in between. Okay, then we have some general notes here. The robot will never be sent outside the bounds of the plane. All inputs should be are well formed and syntactically correct. So, okay, there is no need therefore to implement elaborate input parsing. No input. Do not output any error messages. Okay, the only output should be the number of unique places the robot cleaned. There will be no leading or trailing white spaces on any line of input. Should be no leading or any line of output. Okay. Any multi-value line of input will have a single white space character between each value. Multi-value line of input. Okay, that's where you've got the coordinate. So you'll have one coordinate for the x, a space, and then one coordinate for the y. You can assume, for the sake of simplicity, that the office used is a grid, and the robot cleans at every vertex it touches, not where it stops. Okay, so if we give it a command to go west 5 spaces, it'll clean all 5 spaces in between. The output of your program should be the number u, which represents the number of places you clean, and the output of the number u should be prefixed by cleaned, and then and then we've got an example output input and an example output. Okay, that's great. Okay, so if we start with a new project, this is a very simple prototype, so we can start off perhaps with the console application. It's the client, and that'll be see if we call the system robot cleaner. Client. So we use a simple console application as the client. By the way, I'm using Visual Studio 2013 with resharper here. Okay. now we'll want to add another project, which is our class library, which will be the actual robot cleaner. And then finally we will need a test project. Here we can do a Microsoft test project unit code, and that'll be robot cleaner. Okay. And obviously we want to add references to the robot cleaner. In both the client and the test project. And then here we really want to add make the internals visible to robot cleaner.tests. This way we can see the internal methods and test them. Okay. Alright then. So if we go back to we give our robots a set of inputs, and then we will get an output. Okay, so if we go to our program, here we're going to collect a set of inputs from standard in. Robot should execute cleaning commands, and then it should print out the results. Give output on the number of places cleaned. Okay. Now here we should start thinking about sort of what sort of patterns might come in useful, and obviously I expect, since we're using commands here, the command pattern might be useful. Okay, shall we get started then with our first point, which is where we're going to collect a series of inputs, and we have an example of the input here at the end of our spec. So this is the type we're going to get in through standard in, and obviously we need to test. Create a test that will take these inputs and return some sort of command set. Now obviously in a unit test we don't want to be bothering with, we want to be connected to a dependency of standard in, so instead we'll use just some sort of text. So if we go to our test class, here we'll rename this. Yes, okay. So we've got our first test method here, and test method here will be so the test method will be create command factory, add some inputs, and the correct number of inputs would be the result. Okay. Here we're going to use the arrange act insert. Okay. First of all, we want to create a new command factory. equal to a new command factory. And we want to add some inputs to it. We've got some example inputs here, so we might as well use them. We're going to add inputs. Okay. Yes, sorry, that shouldn't be insert. It should be, of course, assert. So we're going to create our command factory. We're going to add some inputs, and then at the end of it, well, we would want to assert that is true. Our command factory inputs are complete. Okay, so the way I'm thinking here is that here we say we're going to send the command set's going to consist of two commands, and you've got a starting position. And after you get the first command, it's still waiting for another command, so the inputs complete is not true. And after the second command, then we know that the inputs are complete. We don't need to wait for any more input from the console, and then we can carry on and do whatever it is we need to do to clean it out. So here we have our first test, and obviously this test is going to fail. So let's see if we create the class. Yep, and we will to move that to its own file. Thank you very much. Let's not create it as internal. Let's create it as internal. Let's just build that again. Now we've got to create a method, and here we can create a property. Okay, so we've got add inputs, and inputs are complete. If we go to our unit test now and we run, okay, and it's failed because we've got the method add input is not implemented. Okay, so we've come to our first unit test, and once we solve this, we'll be on our way to solving the problem for handling our inputs via standard in. Okay, what is important here, really, if you're using a real test-driven methodology, you really just want to create we want to create the simplest amount of code that will allow us to pass our test to pass. And in this case, we want to, first of all, we're going to have to implement something here. So if we create a list of, well, actually, if you just create a command which is the number of commands. So an internal number of commands. And here we can say when we get a string, which is input string, we can say number of commands plus plus. could return, let's see, if we return very simply number of inputs is equal to 4. Right, if we go back to our robot test now and we run build, we don't need a setter on that. Okay, so now we've got success. So we added 4 inputs, and when there are 4 inputs come in, they're complete. But we've got a couple of problems here because obviously, really, we've just got 2 commands and a header, 2 header lines and 2 commands. So that's not very good with how we've implemented our add commands and how we've implemented our inputs are complete. And secondly, it's not going to work for anything other than something which is 4 lines of code. So if we actually here, if we change this to, we add 2 inputs, and we get back inputs are complete. Sorry, 2 input commands. Inputs are complete. So if we just create a new test, we add 3 input commands. And also inputs are complete. So if we change this to 3, and here we're adding a new one, where we're going, say maybe east, north, and then we go south. Okay, true. Now if we run this, run our unit tests, now we can see the 3 inputs has failed, obviously because we're just hard coded here to accept 4. So now we've really got to interpret. So we know that the first 2 lines consist of the number of commands, and then the next line, the number of commands and the initial position, followed by the number of inputs. So really what we need to do when we get an input is we need to check first of all. First of all, if change this so we've got a private list of string input strings. Okay, and here we could do with constructor. Do we want any of these? Nope. And here we'll create the number of, here we'll create the input strings to be a new list. Okay, so we now have their input strings, and here we can actually properly do our input strings dot add input string. And here we would have input strings dot count. Okay. So if we run back to our tests, just to test, see how the tests are looking. So we haven't. This test is still working, so we haven't made things worse. So when we create a command here, we can check for if input strings dot count is equal to 0. Then we know the we know we're actually dealing with the first command, which contains first line, which changes the number of input commands, which can be from 0 to 10,000. So set number of commands. We'll do that with that input string. Okay. And here we'll just set number of commands is equal to int.try parse string. And then here would be the input string start count should be the same as the right. We've got commands, which is the number of commands, plus we've got the two header lines, the number of commands header and the position header. So let's just run our tests. Right, it's looking good. Okay, so now that we've got those tests, we should probably complement our tests with a few more that test our boundary conditions here. So if we look at our commands, for example, the first line, this could be the range between 0 and 10,000. Okay, 10,000 the first line, or 0. We should test obviously a few of these. So let's do some input number tests. Let's create command vector. We're going to add 0 inputs. So if we set that to 0, and we've got position, and we've got nothing else. Therefore we should have inputs are complete. That should be correct. So let's just test that. Okay. And if we had 10,000, create command factory, add 10,000. Right, so now we've got those boundaries, the 0 and 10. We should also have how are we going to handle if it falls outside the range. Now it says here all inputs should be considered well formed and syntactically correct. So there's no need to liberate parsing and stuff, but you still really should have some simple checks at least. So what happens if we add minus? Okay, what are we going to do there? Well, I think the problem is that in the spec it says here they do not output any error messages. Okay, that doesn't mean we might, well, doesn't mean we don't log them at some point, but for the moment we're not producing any error output, so we should probably try to handle failure as gracefully as possible. So probably I would guess if we should consider all commands that are less than 0 to be the same as 0 as 0, in which case, as long as it's got these first two lines of the header, it'll be complete. So let's check that to see if this runs. No, it didn't run. Okay. And of course that's because we don't handle minus inputs. So here we just try to parse, and here we compare the number of commands here. So we should input number let me just do simple control. If number of inputs is less than 0, then number of inputs is equal to 0. And I guess the same if the number of commands is greater than 10,000, then the number of commands is equal to 10,000. So if we go back to our tests and run our tests now, still failed. Here it has failed because if we go to command factory, even though we set the commands is -3, the number of commands -3, which we then set to 0 here, I assume. As we keep adding more and more, because we add 10,000 commands, so the number of commands here will come up to 10,000, and we're expecting 0. And this is an error in our system here, because we should only be adding be processing commands up until the point where we've got all the commands we want. Now, as long as the inputs are not complete, it'll keep accepting commands, but as soon as it's got the number, if it's being 0 or 10,000, it'll stop. It won't accept any more incoming commands. So let's run our test now again. That's complete. Okay. Yes. So let's just put in last test for more than 10,000. Add 20,000. And here we've set our max limit for 11,000, we can say. Doesn't matter because it'll be set to 10,000, and as long as we get 10,000 commands, that should work. Build succeeded. Run unit tests. Okay, we've got success in all our tests, and we're handling our inputs. Good.